He'll get the camera on you.
Welcome to another edition of Drugs, Crime, and Politics, brought to you by the Drug Policy Forum of Texas. Good evening. I'm your host, Buford Terrell. With me tonight is my colleague, Clay Jones.
Good
to have
evening.
you here as always. And we are pleased tonight to be joined by Cherry Steinwender, Executive Director of the Center for the Healing of Racism, which sounds like something that it would be delightful to discuss for hours and hours. But she's here tonight to talk with us about the Caravan for Peace, which has just left San Diego on its way to Washington, D.C. by a very roundabout route that includes a day and night full of activities here in Houston. So we'll be getting to Cherry and the Caravan for Peace in just a few minutes. But first, there are some interesting news developments that have taken place that we want to bring you up to date on. Last week, the authorities announced the largest pot raid in the history of Texas. A mixed group of several law enforcement agents raided a farm in Polk County near Livingston. They covered 643 acres, that's slightly more than a square mile, divided up into 8 fields, and they claim to have pulled up and destroyed over 30,000 marijuana plants. And they said that it was so many they couldn't even estimate what the street value was. Now, the interesting thing with an operation this size that they had been watching for a number of weeks, as last I heard, they still have not arrested anybody. And then to follow up on it, in the last couple of days, Oklahoma went out and busted a farm with 8,000 plants or so and said, me too, this is the largest bust in the history of Oklahoma. So we're setting records in the middle of the country right now. A couple of major breakthroughs on the medical marijuana front. Arizona conducted its lottery to award dispensary sites across the state and expect them to be open in a matter of a few months at most.
But what's going to happen there?
Well, okay, let's get there in a minute. New Jersey also announced
Chris Christie has gotten big on our side.
that their 6 dispensaries are now ready and should be open for business. Their plants should be mature in another month to 6 weeks.
Mm-hmm.
So those are pretty big steps forward. Now, what about Arizona?
Well, Arizona, we've got the governor going ahead doing exactly what you're supposed to.
Yeah.
Being very deliberate.
Yeah.
But the Attorney General,
Yes.
they're saying, it's against federal law.
Yeah, there's an interesting conflict there because under the state constitution, it's his duty and obligation to defend the state law in court. He's been making such a lot of noise about this that the governor has written and given him a waiver to excuse him from representing the state in any matters involving their medical marijuana law.
Well, let's get rid of you.
Yeah.
Well, we've got a lot of other good things going on. You've got North Dakota, you got Missouri, you got Arkansas, all going for ballot referendums.
Those are all on medical, yeah.
Yeah.
And in Massachusetts, you have the legislature debating it. I don't know when their session is over, but...
I think they're year-round, same...
Yeah, but since they decriminalized, 2 years ago?
2 years ago.
I think it's fairly likely that they'll come ahead with this.
Well, you've got Maine, you've got Vermont, you've got Connecticut, and Rhode Island, all around it that are all medical. In Rhode Island and Maine are just so fed up with it.
Yeah.
I think if any of the ballot referendum states go legal,
Yeah.
they're going to flip.
Yeah. I guess Vermont's the only New England state that has not gone yet.
New Hampshire.
New Hampshire, okay.
Vermont governor is, as a matter of fact, Normal just gave him $2,000 for his reelection committee.
Okay.
They gave the maximum they could give to that governor of Vermont.
Well, to me, the interesting thing, though, is probably going to be the November election, because we definitely have legalization referenda on the ballot in Colorado, Oregon, and Washington. And my own personal handicapping is that in Colorado, it's almost definitely going to pass.
They're pulling over 64%.
Yeah. And if you read the local press, the local newspapers up there, there's really not any organized, strong opposition to
None.
it. So,
None. We're at 17 now. We could be at 3 legal and 20 medical.
yeah. And
Where do we get past that 25 and that tipping point when they're going to have to throw their hands up?
well, we're already there. One interesting thing, 8 members of the California congressional delegation have signed on as co-sponsors for a new bill to recognize state medical marijuana. One measure came up for a vote in the House. I don't remember what it was on exactly, but 186 members voted in favor of relaxing the laws on marijuana. There are, across the country, at least a half a dozen candidates for Congress that are coming out and supporting changes of marijuana laws.
Yes.
So I'm not sure how quickly we'll see the results, but I think we are definitely seeing that politicians no longer are afraid to even mention the subject. The attitude has definitely changed.
There's a lot of politicians now running pro-marijuana campaigns, and they're winning. They're going back into Congress.
Well, we'll see if they go back into Congress. The polls look pretty good, but there's many a slip between a poll and the recount.
Yeah.
And my question is, what about Texas? Where are we in all of this?
Somewhere back between 3000 BC and the Dark Ages.
Thank you.
That's an optimistic view, by the way.
I mean, let's face it. Drug laws are mainly enforced against people of color. You look at our prisons. I don't know. My neighborhood, there's a lot of smokers in my neighborhood, and I live in a good neighborhood. I don't see why a black neighborhood has more people that do it than my neighborhood.
Well, I think we have to go a step further here, though, Clayton. If we had a black neighborhood with the same economic status of your neighborhood, the same kinds of houses, the same kinds of lawns, the same average income in the households, you'd probably see a whole lot more similar. I won't say identical because there's still some problems, but I think it would be a whole lot more similar. What to some extent causes a lot of the unequal enforcement, and we have to go back to Michelle Alexander's book for a lot of this. I mean, that's a beautiful piece of work. Is that most of the high visibility law enforcement and the large numbers of arrests come out from inner city neighborhoods that are economically depressed, where there's a lot of street activity round the clock, where you've got people with houses with no air conditioning and no cable TV, and so they're out in the street at all hours of the day and night. You have a lot of open air drug dealing, and It's more, I think, let's sweep the streets than it is let's go after the drugs.
Okay.
The drugs are the excuse for attacking the streets. They're not the target of the police activity. Am I anywhere near on base here?
I think that you see, it never was a war on crime.
Yeah,
This was a war on human beings.
yeah,
And the human beings happened to be black and brown.
Yeah.
So it was never a war on drugs. But the thing of it is that every time you watch the media, read the media, they make you see that, oh, we got this grandiose war on crime. It never was a war on crime. It was a war on black and brown people.
well,
Yes.
and to some extent, it's one of these self-fulfilling prophecies. Because when you look at the local news on TV, and they show people in shootouts or getting arrested or having fights, what color are they?
And the black and brown people. And at the same time, may I interject? I really want to bring a commercial into this
Okay,
equation.
let's get your commercial
It was
in,
a
please.
public service commercial that was aired a lot in Houston. And they showed in the city black kids playing basketball in the street.
Yeah,
And the voiceover said 40% of all the drugs is found in the inner city. And then the cameras went to the suburbs. And then the voiceover said, do you know where the other 60% is? And that to me is a very powerful message. But I think there's a powerful message in what I saw in an interview with one of the Peruvian drug cartels probably about 10 years ago. And he said, and he grew poppy plants. He said, I don't ever have to make war on Americans. As long as they have such a sensational appetite for drugs, all I have to do is keep flooding this country because of that high sensational appetite we have for drugs. So it's all of these things, but once you look at it, my child will go to prison, but because of good health insurance or whatever, your child may go lay up into a hospital, a treatment, facility. So even that makes the equation totally unequal.
yes, yeah.
Well, it costs so much less to have somebody in rehabilitation than in prison.
Well,
One-
if I may be an optimist for a few seconds, there was an interesting story in this morning's Houston Chronicle pointing out the surprising fact that Texas prisons population has shrunk and is shrinking. And if you dig through and read the fine details, you'll find out that there's been a lot of effort, especially at the local level, to divert drug users into alternative means of dealing with them, like education and treatment and community service. There's been an attempt to provide therapy and rehabilitation rather than prison. We may not learn fast, we may backslide a lot, but every once in a while you see a little teeny glimmer of hope.
Well, I'll repeat Jesse Jackson, then let's keep hope alive. But at the same time, we haven't got there yet.
Well,
and I really love the fact that you brought into the room Michelle Alexander's book, The New Jim Crow.
Right.
Because that book is still selling like hotcakes, and she's on a circuit lecturing, almost 24/7.
Well, if you
that brought a lot to light.
If you were one of our regular viewers, and I hope I've got one or two, you'll know that we've talked about the new Jim Crow almost to the point of, I'm afraid, boring people with it for many months now. It's one of 3 or 4 that lately that have really impressed me with what they say. But let's switch topics now and talk about what we invited you here for. And what's your connection to the Caravan for Peace?
Well, I am on the committee that's putting all of the plans together to bring the Caravan for Peace to Houston, Texas.
Okay.
And you did mention in your opening, the caravan left San Diego, California yesterday.
Yeah.
2 buses that
Okay.
will tour 20 states, 20 cities, 20 states, no, 20 cities.
20 cities, yeah.
And on their way to Washington, D.C. And the reason that they're making this journey and all of these stopovers in order to bring attention to several factors. One of the things and what I want to put my spin on it, they want to put a human face on this so-called drug violence in Mexico, whereas today probably at least 70,000 people have been killed. They want to put a human face on the mothers and the fathers and the sisters and brothers and uncles and aunties and grandmothers and grandfathers that have suffered because of this war, this drug violence in Mexico.
Well, as I understand it, the concept behind this was put together by a Mexican poet who lost an immediate family member
Son.
His
to the
son,
drug.
yes.
Yeah, and his name,
His name is, right now, I guess I'm under
Okay.
pressure, but Jarvis.
I was going to look. I thought I had it, but I don't. But they actually organized 2 tours in Mexico. One going from the border south to Mexico City, and a second one from Mexico City north to the border. And now the third one comes across and into the United States.
And what makes this one so important, because the way that they are pitching this and framing everything in Houston, Texas, I don't know about the other cities, but they really want to bring the voice of what is going on this side of the border,
Right.
having to do not only with people of Latin descent, but of people of African descent on this side of the border. And we are inviting victims from the African American community to be a part of this. We want to hear mothers who I hope bring their pictures of their children, where we can all embrace those children's faces. We can make this thing human, because all too often when we're in front of the media and they're telling us 70,000 dead in Mexico because of the drug violence, when they're telling us 10,000 people have been maimed, when they're telling us 100,000 people may be displaced, that's numbers. We want to put a human face on this. I want to feel you. I want to look into your eyes and know this happened to you. But in doing so, we will also be writing letters from these parents that have lost children, not only to just drug violence, but what about mass incarceration? And you know the numbers. You know right now that within the United States,
Over 2
as we
million.
said, over 2 million.
Yeah.
In 30 years, we went from 300,000 to 2.5 million. We want to hear those stories. And so that's one thing that I say all the time. You may not remember anything that I say, but you will remember the way that I made you feel. And we hope that we will make people feel and feel deeply that this is a human problem, and this problem, especially for Black and brown people, we're talking about our survival. And if we can't come together around any other thing in this country, we really have to come together around this issue.
You said something there that put a picture in my mind of some things I have seen lately on other subjects where memorial services have been held in which the whole service really consisted of parents, mainly mothers, stepping to the lectern and naming their children and what had happened to them. And sometimes these have lines of more than 200 mothers and some fathers telling the stories of their children. These are very impressive things to see. You can't watch them and not be affected.
As part of the organizer, one of the organizers, that's what I wanted. I really wanted a march in Houston, a silent march with mothers from north of the border, south of the border, to carry pictures of their loved ones. Because I think that sends a very powerful message. This was my child. This was a human being. This human being lived. And because of your greed, with your drugs, my child no longer is a part of my life.
We need to take a break now. We'll be back with Cherry Steinwender and talk more about the Caravan for Peace in a few minutes.
El movimiento por la paz con justicia y dignidad invita a todas las organizaciones mexicanas, centroamericanas, norteamericanas, para que se unan a esta caravana en busca de una ruta de paz y de justicia para detener el sufrimiento que la guerra contra las drogas está causando tanto en Centroamérica como en México como en los Estados Unidos. En esta guerra contra las drogas, los Estados Unidos han invertido en México 2,000 millones de dólares. Por desgracia, la mayor parte de ese dinero se ha invertido en armas para el ejército y la policía, en logística militar. Es necesario que esa lógica de seguridad nacional sea cambiada por una lógica de seguridad ciudadana y humana, donde los recursos se inviertan en la refundación de las instituciones que están muy corrompidas en México, en el tejido social que necesita ser fortalecido, en la educación, en la atención a los jóvenes y en el empleo. Sin ese camino vamos a ahondarnos en la violencia y en el dolor y no vamos a encontrar una verdadera seguridad y una verdadera paz.
Good evening. You're watching Drugs, Crime, and Politics on Houston Media Source.
Okay, during the break, we did a little homework. The Mexican poet who has started this whole movement, his name is Javier Cecilia, and he lost his son to the drug war and has formed a foundation that has grown and sponsored all of these marches. Now, the caravan will reach Houston on August the 26th, and please tell us what will happen when it gets here.
As you said, the caravan will arrive at the Dominican Sisters on Alameda at noon on August the 26th. At that time, after giving them just a little while to rest and nourish themselves, then we will head to the first event, which will be a town hall meeting, and that town hall meeting will take place at St. Paul's United Methodist Church on the corner of Fannin and Benz, or Main and Benz.
Okay.
At that particular time,
That's
we
St.
are in
Paul's
the
Methodist at,
United Methodist Church, yes.
Main and Benz.
That's correct. And we are inviting people that will be there to tell their stories.
Okay.
Not just the caravan. The people in the caravan, the count is 110,
Okay.
2 buses rolling in. However, as I understand it, the caravan have picked up so much momentum until people are following the buses, and maybe we will have probably 200 people in Houston
Right.
coming from, other places.
Yeah.
But at this town hall meeting, where people will come together, not only to tell their stories, but to write their stories down, because they will take these messages to Washington, D.C. Everywhere they've been, they want to take a message to Washington, D.C. And I think that is really fantastic, the way that this particular caravan was strategically planned right after the election of the president in Mexico and between the election of a
Yes.
new president within the United
Yeah.
States. And taking those messages, not only from the south of the border,
Yeah.
but from the United States as well. After that, there will be a time, a dinner.
What was the time of day for this?
3
town hall?
o'clock. If that
3
one
o'clock.
is
Yeah.
3 o'clock till 5 o'clock.
Okay.
After which, we will go to St. Stephen's Episcopal Church so that the people on the buses can eat.
Yeah.
And that is only for the people, on the buses. But we will have a visual at the Rothko Chapel. And we hope
Okay.
that people come out and just to show solidarity for the people coming from Mexico and all of the violence that have happened to people here on this side of the border.
And there's one thing about the Rothko Chapel. The chapel itself is fairly small, but it's surrounded by, I don't know how large the grounds of the Menil system are, but there are room for thousands to be and show their support there.
And so we will
Quietly
have
and
candles.
respectfully, yeah.
Yes, in order to do that.
Yeah.
I understand also that there are a few artists that will have their art displayed,
Yeah.
Along the route. We will, make a very powerful showing.
Yeah.
My only hope is that we get people to really understand and to feel
Yeah.
the loss that we have. Because I use the words all the time of Martin Luther King, that all life is interconnected. Until you realize that I am just as connected to you as you are to me, that my life have to mean something to you as your life mean to me. And this is the message that we have to carry. This is the message that will be taken to Washington, D.C., that we want to say, put a stop to all of this drug violence. And as the man said, as long as we have such a sensational appetite on this side of the border, the whole drug war, regardless of what side of the border it's on, this is a connected thing. Whatever affects Mexico is affecting us and vice versa.
Yeah. Now, there's one thing that struck me when you were describing this. We start out with lunch at the Dominican Sisters. We go from there to a Methodist church, and from there to an Episcopalian church, and from there to the Rothko Chapel. It sounds like you've got a pretty broad spectrum of people involved here.
Well, we tried very hard to look at it that way because, as I said, we all connected. You have to be able to know my humanity. And so to be able to see that this is a human thing. Human beings worship in many different ways, not only just in different colors. So this is a human thing.
Well, also, as I understand, they'll be spending the night here in Houston.
Yes.
And there's one last event the next morning.
And the
even.
next morning at Rice University, at the Bakers Institute, there will be a press conference. And then later at the Dominican Sisters, another press conference before they are, get on the bus and travel to New Orleans at that time. So our commitment to them, that we as hosts have to take care of them, which means when they get on the bus, they will also be given a paper bag luncheon so that they will have food for that 6 to 7 hour drive to New Orleans.
Well, as someone who lived in New Orleans for several years, I have to ask this question. What in the world can you be brave enough to put in a sack lunch to people who are about to go eat in New Orleans?
Well, I could say since I was born and raised in New Orleans, in Lake Charles, Louisiana, we will not be putting gumbo.
It's kind of hard to think about being the precursor to a New Orleans feed, though.
But we work with what we have.
Yeah.
We work with it.
Well, actually, come to think about that, may not be too bad after all, because, sometimes good turns bring their own rewards. And after Katrina, Houston pretty well opened its doors to people from New Orleans. And we've gotten a reward out of it in that a lot of the good, vibrant, and juicy part of New Orleans culture has bubbled up and enriched those of us here in Houston.
A lot of people have stayed from
Yeah.
Louisiana
Yeah.
when they came here. They haven't gone back.
Yeah.
And then I think it's also critical because in order to connect these two stories together, and I know that you said that you've talked about Michelle Alexander several
Yeah.
times, and maybe the listening audience is tired,
Yeah.
but we want the people south of the border to know what's happening to us.
Yeah.
And I think if I said nothing else tonight, that if I left your audience with, right now, according to Michelle Alexander, there are more black people incarcerated than was on plantations in 1850. When I heard that, that was a real eye-opening, and I tried to picture the plantations.
Yeah.
I tried to picture how many people is incarcerated because of drug
Yeah.
crimes, and a lot of them are felons. They're not violent criminals. And when I think about all of this, and so I want the people south of the border to also know that we're giving up our lives, and we've already lost 3 generations of black men. And I said this to someone,
Yeah.
and they said, at least 3 generations.
Yeah, and what I'm thinking right now, Chicago, which is also on the map for the caravan,
Right.
is going through a very brutal upswing in gang violence and gang warfare. And to some extent, it looks like a lot of this is because a lot of the top leaders and bosses of the gangs up there have disappeared either through incarceration or murder or retirement. And there's a bunch of kids trying to establish dominion that really don't know how it's done, but also some indication at least of some connections between them and the Mexican gangs. So
As I said, all life is interrelated. And I can see this. I can see what happens here is connected to what happens in Mexico.
Yeah.
What happened in Mexico is connected to what happened here.
Yeah.
But we need to form a real coalition. Maybe not even a coalition. Maybe we need to form what I would call family in order to be able to see how connected we are.
one thing I'm thinking, and you're talking about the emphasis you're putting here on the losses to people through the drug war, is that one thing that no one has really focused on or concentrated on is the horrible, brutal cost the war on drugs has imposed on all of society. In Vietnam, they invented that wonderful phrase, collateral damage. And in several years of doing this show now, one of the guests I interviewed that has stuck with me over the years as much as anything was a woman, a retired juvenile probation officer, who went back in and organized self-directed support groups for high school students whose parents were in prison. And if we look at the number, for instance, of women in federal prison on drug charges, it really kind of stretches the mind to even think about the number of children that the drug war has orphaned without doing anything about seeing that they don't suffer for it. The number of families that have lost someone shot down through violence over the drug laws. I mean, you just can't even start to add it up. So,
And so as to recall again from Michelle Alexander, nothing short of a real social movement is going to change this thing around. And it's going to take all of us. We're going to have to hold hands across the border
yeah.
in order to start this social movement. And I feel in a very small way it's beginning to take off.
Yeah.
But I think we need to have more shows that deal with this, as well as the psychological, the economic, the physical cost of this drugs. And as it said, it's not about drugs. We're talking about a war on human beings.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know, the drugs is just the excuse. We've all talked about it before. Before the laws were making drugs illegal, they weren't a problem in our country.
They were not a major problem.
Well,
Okay.
not a major problem. People knew that took drugs knew they had to work back then. You know, there wasn't the violence that there is today about it. It's the black market that they've developed that has made everything so dramatic. So many people getting killed.
You know, we talk about the gang violence in Mexico. And the drug war in this country has really been going on since Reagan in strong detail and since Nixon originally. But in Mexico, it dates back at least 20 years before that. And it's boiled up to the point we have now. If you look at our laws prohibiting alcohol, which weren't nearly as restrictive as the drug laws, they lasted for a mere 13 years.
Yeah.
And before that 13 years was over, we had the same sort of almost uncontrolled gang violence, mass shootings with machine guns, bombs in the streets, that had it gone another 50 years, it would have been like Mexico is today. We pulled the plug on that mistake. We just can't seem to figure out how to pull the plug on this one. So, well, I'd like to remind the viewers that our friend on the show, Dean Becker, is riding one of those buses. For those of you that follow him on the radio with his Drug Truth Network shows, I think he's been maybe sending in tapes to those, and you can follow. But Dean is at least one local representative from Houston that's taking part in this, and I'm sure when he gets back we'll be able to get him and get some of his information. And let me remind you again that this is your show. We welcome your calls. Please call in with any comments or questions you have, and we'll do our best to handle them.
Numbers on the TV.
Yeah.
We're here for you.
Yeah.
Give us your questions. We'll do our best to answer it.
And every once in a while, even I admit I don't know. Well, do you have anything else you want to add about what's going on with the caravan?
The only other thing that I would add is that I am really looking forward to hearing those stories. I'm looking forward to those messages that these parents will write that will go to Washington, D.C. So I'm really excited about that.
Yeah, I know that the caravan has a website. I don't have it here in front of me, but maybe Steve can find out what it is and put it up. But that would let you follow the progress of it across the country. And I'm not sure that it's something to brag about or something to hang our head in shame about. But when I looked at the map and just kind of glanced at it, it looked like there were more stops in Texas than anywhere else
Yes,
on the trip.
I noticed that too. And I really check that out.
Yeah.
But in fact, when we were talking before the cameras were rolling, and you were talking about, you were mentioning it, something going on in Washington, no, in New York.
Yeah.
And you said, well, gee whiz, we'll wait till they get to New York to address that. No, I know that was part of the meeting today, so I'm going to too many meetings.
Yeah.
And they wanted to talk about what just happened in New York with crime and drug and violence.
Yeah.
And said, well, let's not talk about that. Let's just focus on Houston, Texas.
Yeah.
Because when they get to New York, then they're going to have to deal with that.
Yeah.
So it's like all of these places that they're going, they're hot spots for all of this type of, violence and incarcerations.
Well, yes, speaking roughly, they will enter Texas at El Paso and then take a swing down through the deep valley along the Mexican border, then back up through San Antonio and to Dallas before coming back down to Houston. So they'll be pretty well, and I believe they're in Austin the night before they're here.
Yes, correct.
So Texas is a big state. It's got a lot of involvement in the drug laws, even though you don't hear that much about it. And will be fairly prominent in this caravan as it develops. So, and we'll take another break. And when we come back, I want to find out a little bit more about the Center for the Healing of Racism.
The whole idea of a drug-free America and zero tolerance really doesn't make much sense, does it? So it does make sense, however, to find ways to reduce the harms associated with drugs. And that's what I want to talk about.
To start thinking about whether it is really laws that make the difference on whether people use drugs or not.
Al Capone didn't shoot people because he was intoxicated.
Right, exactly.
Those people are not fighting over drugs, they're fighting over money.
Drug laws have no basis in science. Drug laws are based on politics and
So
money.
there's this unholy symbiosis between, on the one hand, those who are selling illegal drugs, the drug lords, if you will, and on the other side, the drug warriors.
War on drugs isn't working, and that, if anything, is just making what we call the drug problem a lot worse.
Hey, this is Tommy Chong, and you're watching Drugs, Crime, and Politics.
At West Gray Cafe still, 7:30.
Is this week, West Gray?
Yeah. Okay, I'd like to remind everyone that Houston Normal will have their monthly meeting this Thursday at 7:30 at the West Gray Cafe. That's on West Gray, a block or two east of Montrose Boulevard. It's always an interesting hour or two, so stop by and see what's happening.
And
Okay.
I want to also really thank all of the organizations that's endorsing this whole
Okay.
Caravan for Peace,
Okay.
because there are about 20 organizations in Houston,
Okay.
and we are all coming together in one way or another to support this event.
Okay.
So I guess you would say that there's a lot of people that have the same concern
Yeah.
about what's going on.
And are they listed on a website or something?
I'm pretty sure that they are,
Okay.
because I know that we asked each one of them to send in their logos so that
Yeah.
that could be publicized. So it's not just one little small organization, but it's a lot of organizations.
Yeah.
And when I look at this also, there's a story that I heard just today. And when you talk about this violence, you may automatically see military or militias using guns and weapons, and but you don't think about the collateral damage of
Yeah.
young people that's just caught in the crosswalk. Fighting
Are the-
over drug turfs, and
The 82-year-old grandmother who's shot when the police
Yes,
break into the
yes,
wrong
yes,
apartment.
Yes, and you're talking about people that have left their home
Yeah.
because they're so afraid of the
Yeah.
violence that's happening. And I know one friend of mine, And I call him my little brother now, and he's been in this country now probably about 15 years. And one of those human stories that this kid was in the university to be a doctor in Nicaragua, and his mother encouraged him to leave, to cross the border, to come here undocumented, to keep her son safe. This mother gave up her son because of being caught in this violence. So when we think about this, we have to also think that it's not just people that's being shot, that's in the war themselves, but the people that are innocent that's being shot. So I think that story today really touched my heart, and I had to say that. But when you're talking about the profiling all of these people, how racial profiling is alive and well in this country. And I love the way that it was framed by the President Bill Clinton's task force that studied race relations in this country. And I love the way they said it, racial profiling, a crime often committed driving while black. Well, I said driving while black, walking while black or brown, sitting while black or brown, whatever while black and brown. That is also another component that when you are stopped, maybe one of the first things they're going to want to know is if you have any drugs in your car, whether you have them or not. But it's all of that stuff that is creating all this tension and this violence.
And a lot of the violence stems from basic distrust. And a lot of the distrust comes from the fact that so many people in one way or another are forced to live, if not outside the law, at least on the fringes of the law.
But then we have to look at the economics. I would say that a lot of this, the gang wars, and that's about economics. You follow the money trail. Follow the money trail, because it's about economics.
Well, I can't follow the money trail because the money trail won't release its tax returns, and it hides all the cash in the Cayman Islands.
Oh, you're talking about Mick.
Now, I keep thinking, aren't the Cayman Islands where the drug smugglers launder their money?
Yeah, and why does Mitt have bank accounts down there?
Well, but part of it, and part of it, the insanity, the absolute insanity, is that the law is trying to do an impossible thing, and it makes it worse. Did you know, for instance, that when they were both legal, the Bayer Company, which manufactured both of them, sold heroin and aspirin for exactly the same price? And heroin right now goes for over $50,000 a pound retail. That's what the drug law does. That's where the money comes from. The money from the drug laws is just like pouring gasoline onto the fires that have always smoldered in Mexico or Chicago.
But now you got the PRN coming back into power. They've had the undisclosed truces with all these drug people. Let's not have violence. Are we going to go back to that? You exist over there.
Once again, part of the problem in the last few years, the structure of the Mexican cartels have changed. And one of the big changes was the rise of Los Zetas, who started out as professional enforcers and assassins hired by one of the cartels. And then they decided to get into the business themselves, and to some extent they were what pushed the war over the edge. But we also, Calderon especially, broke up the connections between the cartels and the local and regional police forces, so that no longer could a cartel simply buy its plaza or place of operation and everyone else stayed clear. We also have, starting really in the 90s. The first time a real mixture of marijuana growers with cocaine transshippers, with opium growers, and instead of each running their own business, they all started fighting for a mixture of it, and it has turned into just a real mix, and I'm not sure you can lay sole blame on any one of the Mexican political parties.
Yeah.
Now, chances are with PRI back in power, they'll do like Colombia did and simply come to a means of accommodation with can't we all get along and share the goodies? And Colombia still produces lots of cocaine and heroin and still ships it out.
Yep.
But they don't have shooting in the streets anymore.
But I think also that we have to look at all of the things involved when you're talking about drugs. You're talking about also human trafficking.
Same thing, it's
That is-
prohibition.
all of these things are
Yeah.
tied together. When you also look at, right now that disturbs me greatly is the privatizing of prisons. That really disturbs me because I know that in the 30s, this country said privatized prison was totally inhumane. But yet and still, here we are now having this upsurge of privatized prison.
Well,
So it's like,
That's
gee
because
whiz,
we're
we're
80
going to
years
just,
later.
You know,
We've changed our minds.
prisons don't spend a lot of extra money on prisoners. And with the kind of minimal standards we have in prisons, you can't convince me there's any way a private company can deliver the same services and show a profit too. Something is got to give them that profit. And one of the things that has to give in that is public safety. Some things just
we back on
should
that?
not be done for profit.
and then when I look at sometimes, and I look at the present day crisis
Yeah.
of the lack of jobs, every time you post a job, at least 500 people is applying for the same job.
Yeah.
Then sometimes I say, well, gee whiz, if you want a job, just go to prison. Because they have a job there, everything, they are making all these goods within the prison, using cheap free labor, and they're sending this stuff out here for us, the consumers, to buy it.
Well,
But-
see,
Actually, that's
Prison-
illegal in most places. What they do in prisons is manufacture the stuff they use in prisons or that's used by state agencies. For instance, if you have a desk in a state office building, that was probably made in a prison. But because of the really bad excesses of the old chain gangs, most places, prisons are prevented from competing in the private economic market. So,
Okay.
so we do occasionally learn a little bit.
Well, I hope that that little bit but can grow and grow and grow. And I think until we have more public outcry, I hope that many people in Houston will be able to see those caravans. The 110 people that's on those buses, I hope as many people as possible will be out there to hear their stories and maybe in turn want to share their stories.
Well,
because I think that's where we're going to connect humanity to humanity.
What I hope is that this caravan stirs up enough notice that the general media take some notice of it and give it some broader exposure than we can do on this show. And in fact, this is that time of the night that I normally tell you to write your representatives. Tonight, I think I want to give you a different project at home. That this time I want you to write, all right. But first, I want you to submit a flood of letters to the editor right now so that some of them can be published before August the 26th, saying, hey, Houstonians, come and listen to the people on the Caravan for Peace. And then as soon as the caravan leaves, I want more letters to the editor saying, hey, did you hear what those people on the Caravan for Peace said? Let's get the word out. Let's see if we can't get the media excited and paying some attention to it. And we've got about 4 minutes left. If you've got a minute or two to give your side of something to the audience, go right ahead.
And as you send those letters, if any of those stories touch your heart, I want you to send those letters in as well. Because as I said, and I repeat it over and over again, I could say 70,000 people dead. I could say 10,000 misplaced. I could give you a lot of numbers. But until you can hear those stories that will touch your heart.
What was I believe it's usually attributed to Stalin that one death is a tragedy, but 1 million deaths is just a statistic.
So I don't want the 70,000 or the 130 or the 10,000 to be just a statistic. I want them to live in your heart and your mind. And this is what happened to me as part of this project. This is not just a project. This is something that touched my heart. And I want your heart to be touched and maybe you to be transformed.
Thank you. Clayton?
Well, I get the same old things. Thursday, there's a normal meeting, and I think it's time everybody sit down and write their letters. I think that's the most important thing any of us can do right now, is keep after our politicians.
Yeah. And I think we might add to that, if you get a chance between now and November, you might try to ask some of the candidates where they stand on issues that concern you. You'll probably have trouble getting a sharp, definite answer out of them, but it does some good just to ask and make them think about it. And Cherry, I'm so glad you were here tonight.
It's my pleasure.
It's been a wonderful conversation, and I hope maybe sometime in the future you can come back and we can talk about healing racism.
Well, just give me an invitation.
Okay.
Right.
So, and remember this, to repeat, the Caravan will be here in Houston on August the 26th and depart on August the 27th. It will be in Austin the day before on the 25th. So if you really want to hear what they have to say, that's close enough that you could make 2 days out of it. And I think one thing that we can leave thinking about, one thing that this caravan points out to us, is that the drug war and its problems exist on both sides of, well, from this side it's the Rio Grande, from the other side it's the Rio Bravo, but the drug war and the people involved span both banks, and we need to do more than simply stare across and call each other names. This is a nice attempt at trying to find a meeting in the middle. And we will be back again as usual in 2 weeks. And remember, you can find us either on Houston Media Source or on the dpft.org website, where our videos are available for viewing at any time. Thank you and good night.
Good night. Good night.
We have these private prisons that have now hired lobbyists to go get minimum mandatory review.
I began to understand that the 17 or the 19-year-old kid I had in the backseat of my police car was not a criminal at all.
Remove the profit motive. If you remove the profit motive, you can do away with almost all these problems. And how do you do that? Simple. The end prohibition, which can only mean one thing: legalize drugs. Legalize all drugs.
If we really want to improve our urban neighborhoods, the most important thing that we could do, the single most important thing that